Okay, let's see.
Number 12. The Voynich Manuscript. The book that makes readers invent a language just to hear it speak. The vellum crackles in your hands like dry leaves. It is smaller than you expected, about the size of an ordinary hardback, plain enough to disappear on a shelf. Then the pages open, and the room changes. Plants no botanist can name twist across the parchment. Star wheels open into careful circles. Naked women drift through green pools linked by pipe-like channels, as if the book is mapping a body, or a cosmos, or something no one remembers how to describe. Every line of text looks disciplined and deliberate, repeated by a steady hand. No one can read a single sentence. Not in 1912, when Wilfrid Voynich pulled it from a secret Jesuit sale near Rome. Not after decades of cryptographers, historians, and codebreakers tried to force it open. Knowledge precise enough to fill 234 pages has stayed mute for 6 centuries. Stay with him. Italy, 1912. You are in a room where the best items go first. Wilfrid M. Voynich is already known in the trade. Polish-born, sharp-eyed, a dealer with shops in London and Florence, the kind of man who can tell a buyer what century they are touching before the buyer has finished pretending not to care. Around him are manuscripts with obvious value, the kind that sell themselves. Illuminated leaves, fine bindings, pieces with names, pieces with saints, pieces a collector can place in a cabinet and explain to dinner guests in under 30 seconds. But his hand stops on something else, a plain vellum volume, roughly 225 by 160 millimeters. No jeweled cover, no famous title, no gold shouting from the shelf. Just a compact block of old parchment, the work of 14 or 15 calfskins cut, stretched, scraped, and sewn into a book small enough to hold in one hand. Beside the other material in the sale, it should have looked cheap, forgettable even. Voynich opens it, and the first thing he sees is order, not beauty, order. Lines of script run left to right in a consistent hand. The characters repeat in patterns. Words cluster with a rhythm that looks learned, not improvised. The book behaves like language. Then the next page breaks that confidence. The page after that does it again. A fold-out opens into circular diagrams, neat and deliberate, like astronomy translated by someone from another planet. Another section fills with plants, page after page, 113 species in all by modern counting, and not one securely matched to the natural world. Their roots fork the wrong way. Their leaves borrow from one plant and flowers from another. Their stems look remembered rather than observed. Then come the women, pale bodies, tiny crowns of hair, immersed in green pools, moving through vessels and tubes that look half plumbing, half anatomy. If it is medicine, it is unlike any medical book he knows. If it is devotion with very strange habits. Voynich keeps turning pages, because each one seems to promise the last one will make sense in another 10 seconds. It never does. Somewhere inside is a letter, Latin, 17th century, signed by Johannes Marcus Marci, physician in Prague, writing to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher. Marci reports a story already old by then. Emperor Rudolph II bought the manuscript for 600 gold ducats and believed it to be the work of Roger Bacon. 600 ducats. That is not curiosity money. It is court money, obsession money. The price of a book someone thinks contains a secret worth possessing before anyone else can name it. Now the little plain volume changes in Voynich's hands. It is no longer just an oddity from a Jesuit cache near Rome, wherever precisely that cache had been hidden before it surfaced. It is a relic with a pedigree, a cipher manuscript, maybe imperial, maybe scientific, maybe magical. Maybe the lost work of one of the most famous minds of the Middle Ages. Voynich is a dealer. He knows what a story can do to paper. He is also too experienced to ignore the object itself. The parchment is old. The inks sit in it with age. The structure is coherent. Nothing about it feels casually fake. That matters in the room because every other item can be described. This one can only be handled. He turns another fold-out. Rosettes now. Castles or cells. Ribbon-like paths crossing from circle to circle. It looks designed. It looks systematic. It looks like a key to something. The writing looks readable. The pictures look explainable. Together they make the book feel one breakthrough away from surrender. So Voynich does what a man like Voynich would do. He takes it out into the world and gives the mystery its most durable name, his own. In London, in letters, in conversations with scholars and collectors, he starts building the manuscript's aura. not crudely, not by inventing a dragon where there is none. He takes the most combustible possibilities already attached to it and sets them close together. Rudolph II, Roger Bacon, cipher, lost knowledge, medieval science, forbidden learning. You can feel the machine engage the moment those parts click into place. The book no longer has to be read to become dangerous. It only has to suggest that it once could be. People lean in. You can picture the page spread on a desk under electric light, years after that sale. Experts bend over the script with magnifiers. Index cards stack up. Alphabets are proposed. Frequencies are counted. Whole careers pause in front of one folio. In 1921, William Romain Newbold announces that he has solved it. Not tentatively, not cautiously, but with the full confidence this kind of object always seems to summon. He claims the manuscript contains hidden revelations from Roger Bacon, encoded beneath the visible writing itself. For a moment, the locked door appears to open. It does not. Newbold's solution collapses. Scholars pull at the threads, and the method comes apart in their hands. The secret text was not there. The proof was not proof. Yet the manuscript survives the failure untouched, because the failure only deepens the script's power. One intelligent reader after another steps forward convinced that he, or later she, will be the one to hear the book correctly at last. The pattern begins here, in that first handling, because the object is built almost perfectly to produce it. It has enough structure to deny nonsense, enough nonsense to defeat structure, enough age to command respect, enough obscurity to invite projection. It does not sit on the table like a hoax. It sits there like a memory from a civilization standing just out of frame. Voynich dies in 1930, but the manuscript keeps moving from hand to hand, private owner to private owner, carrying its silence with it. In 1961, the dealer H.P. Krauss buys it for $24,500, plus half of any future sale. Later offers it for $160,000, and still cannot place it. By 1969, it reaches Yale, where it becomes Beinecke MS 408, neat shelf mark, neat catalog title, cipher manuscript. The label is orderly, the object is not. The pages remain what they were in that room in 1912, 234 parchment pages, script without a known language, images without a stable category, materially real, semantically unreachable. Then the last comfort goes too. Between 2009 and 2011, radiocarbon testing dates the parchment to 1404 to 1438. The strangest easy answer dies there. The manuscript is not a modern fake, not a Victorian prank, not Voynich's invention. It is genuinely medieval, and the silence gets harder. Number 11. The Book of Enoch. In February 1774, the Society of Antiquaries in London heard a report from a Scottish traveler who had just returned from Ethiopia with 3 manuscripts that almost nobody in Europe believes still existed. His name was James Bruce. He was 43 years old, 6'4", famously stubborn, and fresh off years of crossing the Red Sea world in search of the source of the Nile. Yet the books he claimed may have been even more disruptive than the river. They were copies of the Book of Enoch, a work known from ancient quotations, suspected by many to be lost, and dangerous for a very particular reason. Not because it taught people how to summon demons, because it gave an origin story for evil that refused to stay inside the lines later religion preferred. Bruce had left Britain in 1768. He came home in 1773 after crossing a world of heat, mountains, court ritual, monastic libraries, and armed roads. Ethiopia was one of the few places on earth where Enoch had never truly disappeared. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, it remains scripture. It was copied in Ge'ez and read as part of a living canon, while most of Europe treated it like a rumor from the early church. This is one way knowledge vanishes without fully dying. It does not always burn. Sometimes it survives in a place the winners are not looking. Bruce knew what he was carrying. By the 1st century CE, the Epistle of Jude had echoed a line now numbered as 1 Enoch 1:9, which means early Christians knew the book. Church fathers discussed it. Scholars chased fragments of its reputation through Greek and Latin references. Later Jewish canon did not keep it, and most Christian canons did not keep it either. In the West, Enoch collapsed into hearsay, a missing apocalypse, a suspicious relic, a text too tangled up with angels, giants, and forbidden secrets to fit neatly inside a biblical table of contents. And Enoch is full of those secrets. Its oldest layers were shaped in the Second Temple period, probably between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Inside the book, Enoch is taken up into heaven and shown the hidden architecture behind the visible world. He sees the storehouses of the winds, the ordered courses of the stars, the prisons of rebellious angels, the judgment waiting at the end. But the most explosive claim comes near the beginning. Evil is not explained mainly through Adam's disobedience. It breaks into the world when heavenly beings descend, take human women, father monstrous giants, and teach humanity corrupting arts, metalworking for violence, sorcery, cosmetics, hidden knowledge. Civilization itself starts to look contaminated from above. That is, the contamination at the center of the book. If your theology depends on guarding the boundary between heaven and earth, Enoch tears through it. If your canon depends on clean origins, Enoch muddies them. If your authority depends on deciding which ancient voices count, Enoch is trouble by design. It sounds old because it was old. It had been read, it had been quoted, and it told a story that made the transmission of knowledge itself look suspect. Because some knowledge, in its own telling, entered the world as rebellion. So when Bruce came home with complete Ethiopic copies, a text that in its standard form runs to 108 chapters, he was doing more than reviving a curiosity. He was reopening a case many scholars had quietly assumed was closed. Europe could read Enoch again, but only through a language and a church tradition many Western scholars treated as peripheral. The prejudice was built in from the start. To accept Bruce's manuscripts meant admitting that a book nearly erased from the Western story of Scripture had been preserved outside that story. Bruce's success was fragile from the moment he brought the manuscripts back. A text carried from Ethiopia in 1773 could still be dismissed as late, exotic, corrupted. Useful, perhaps, but not original. Critics had an easy line ready. This was not ancient Jewish literature at all. Only a medieval Ethiopian survival dressed in older clothes. Bruce had restored the book's body to Europe. Its credibility was still missing. The evidence that could settle that argument would appear long after his death. Bruce died in 1794. More than 150 years later, in the caves near Qumran above the Dead Sea, the case changed. Cave 4 produced 11 Aramaic manuscripts of 1st Enoch, not one neat codex, fragments, shards, but enough to force the issue open. Among them were copies of the Book of Watchers, manuscripts scholars label 4Q201, 4Q202, and 4Q204 through 4Q206, with the oldest, 4Q201, dated roughly to 200 to 150 BCE. Another fragment, 4Q208, from the astronomical book, is dated by script to around 200 BCE. The reversal was now impossible to miss. The book Bruce had carried from Ethiopia was not a late invention. It was the surviving complete witness to a much older Jewish apocalypse that had circulated around the Dead Sea more than 2 millennia earlier. The Qumran fragments preserve only about 1/5 of the later Ethiopic text, but that was enough. Enough to prove deep antiquity, enough to show transmission through Aramaic, then Greek, then Ethiopic. Enough to expose how badly the Western map of lost and authentic had misled people. But the fragments opened a new problem as quickly as they solved the old one. They did not preserve everything. The section often called the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, does not appear among the Qumran Enoch fragments. That absence matters because it contains some of the book's most debated Son of Man language, the part later readers most often set beside the New Testament. So Qumran proved Enoch ancient, but not simple, genuine, but composite, confirmed, but still unstable at exactly the points theology cares about most. Picture Bruce for a moment. You return from Africa with a book Europe thinks it misplaced for 1,000 years. You insist it matters. In London, men listen. Some nod politely, some doubt you outright. Then history catches up and announces that the thing in your hands was the remnant of a world they no longer knew how to see. Not a fantasy, not a pious forgery, a survivor. That survivor carried the same unsettling message through every stage of its life. Knowledge can vanish from one civilization while remaining alive in another. A book can be cited by Jude, copied at Qumran, canonized in Ethiopia, and still be treated elsewhere as if it never properly belonged. The argument is never only about whether a text is true. it is also about who gets to decide the shelf on which truth may stand. Bruce was not executed, imprisoned, or formally banned for Enoch. His ordeal was quieter than that, and in some ways more revealing. He carried evidence across continents, but the hardest border was not geographic, it was canonical. Tradition drew that line so firmly that even an ancient witness could reach the threshold and still be treated as an outsider. Enoch was dangerous in the most durable way a book can be dangerous. It preserved a memory of the past that later gatekeepers could not comfortably absorb. When the fragments finally surfaced, they did not make the boundary cleaner. They made it look historical, human, negotiated. The lost book was not lost. It had been left out. The words of the blessing of Enoch. Number 10. The Gospel of Judas. In 1983, Stephen Emmel walked into a hotel room in Geneva and found one of the strangest crime scenes in manuscript history. Not blood, not fingerprints, papyrus. Loose leaves wrapped in newspaper, stacked in shoeboxes, shown under supervision by dealers who would not allow photographs, would not allow notes, and wanted $3 million in cash before anyone could seriously pursue the thing. Emmel and two colleagues got just enough time to look, not enough to secure it. In those boxes sat a Coptic codex, already broken, already scattered, and possibly carrying a title scholars knew from a denunciation written 1,800 years earlier, the Gospel of Judas. That is the version people remember, the forbidden gospel that proves Judas was the one disciple who truly understood Jesus, the lost book that flips Christianity upside down in a single move. The traitor recast as the hero. It is clean, it is cinematic, the evidence is not. Start with the oldest witness, because the first clue is not the manuscript itself, it is an attack. Around AD 180, Irenaeus of Lyons wrote against heresies and complained about a group who, he said, produced a text they called the Gospel of Judas. His summary is brief, hostile, and crucial. Judas alone knew the truth, and by acting on that knowledge, he brought about the events that followed. Two things follow immediately. The text was not invented in the modern black market. It was known in the 2nd century, but it enters the historical record only as something somebody wanted crushed. So the codex does not begin as revelation, it begins as contraband. The next clues are physical. The surviving manuscript is not a 1st century autograph. It never claimed to be. Radiocarbon tests at the University of Arizona sampled 5 tiny pieces of papyrus and leather, and dated the codex to AD 220 to 340, 3rd or 4th century, late enough to disappoint anyone hoping for a document copied during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, early enough to place it squarely inside the world of ancient Christian argument, when rival gospels, secret teachings, and theological knife fights were still alive. Then the page count, 66 pages in all, written in Coptic, not Greek, inside a larger codex that contained more than just Judas. That matters. The object was never some single polished bombshell prepared for modern cameras. It was one battered book among other battered texts, copied by hand in Egypt, preserved by accident, and later torn apart by greed and neglect. Neglect is almost too gentle a word for what happened next. After surfacing near El Minya in Middle Egypt in the late 1970s and being sold in 1978 to a Cairo dealer known as Hannah, the codex drifted through the antiquities gray market. There was a robbery, there was a detour through Geneva, there was the hotel room. No institution agreed to pay $3 million for a manuscript with murky origins. So, the book did not go to a lab, it went to a bank. In 1984, it was taken to New York and sealed inside a safe deposit box in Hicksville, Long Island. It sat there for roughly 16 years. Papyrus can survive in dry Egyptian ground for centuries. Lock it in the wrong modern environment, and it starts to die. Fibers separate, ink flakes, pages stiffen, crack, and shed into fragments. The Codex had already survived the ancient church's effort to erase books condemned as heresy. Storage nearly finished it. That is where the myth breaks down. People hear "forbidden book" and picture one clean act of suppression. A bishop orders a burning. Soldiers raid a library. End of story. This one survived the first purge and nearly lost the second war to something far more ordinary: price, secrecy, and incompetence. Sometimes knowledge does not vanish because someone destroys it elegantly. It vanishes because nobody puts it on the record before it crumbles. In April 2000, the codex reached Frieda Nussberger Chakos. The pace changed. The manuscript was recognized and circulated to specialists, and Yale's Robert Babcock identified what many suspected. Among the fragments was the long-rumored Gospel of Judas. Yale did not buy it, but not because scholars thought it trivial. The issue was provenance. No clean excavation, no secure chain of custody, too many shadows. For museums and universities, that is not a footnote. It is the difference between preserving history and rewarding the trade that shreds it. Then came the forensic grind. Conservation first, authentication next. This part is drier and much more convincing. Ink analysis at Macron Associates found no evidence that the manuscript itself was a modern fake. One ink raised alarms because it resembled later iron gall formulations, more familiar from medieval documents. For a moment, that looked bad. Then comparisons with 3rd century Egyptian texts showed that unusual metal-based inks did exist in that world. Not proof of fraud, not proof of innocence on its own either. But set beside the radiocarbon dates, the Coptic script, the codicology, the damage pattern, and the way all of it fit together, the case held. A fake can imitate one layer. Faking all of them at once is much harder. By 2006, Rodolphe Kasser and a conservation team had reconstructed enough of the shattered leaves for National Geographic to unveil the text to the world. Then the old myth changed clothes. The new headline said, Judas was not the villain at all, but the disciple who understood Jesus better than the others, the chosen insider who handed him over as part of a hidden plan. That reading came straight out of the excitement of publication, and it was explosive for obvious reasons. The most hated name in the Christian story, recast as the only one who got it right. But the text itself does not stay that neat. Even after reconstruction, key passages remained fragmentary. Translation choices mattered. Tiny gaps mattered. Tone mattered even more. Was Judas being elevated above the other disciples, or singled out for a darker role inside a brutal cosmology? Later scholars, most famously April DeConnick, argued that the early, rehabilitated Judas reading went too far. In this gospel, Judas may still be condemned, still aligned with the demonic order he thinks he understands. Same manuscript, same damaged lines, very different verdict. The strongest conclusion is narrower and stranger than the TV version. The Gospel of Judas is real as an ancient text. The surviving codex is ancient too, a 3rd or 4th century Coptic manuscript, preserving a work known by AD 180. It was not exposed as a modern forgery. But the biggest claim attached to it, that it cleanly redeems Judas, lands exactly where the papyrus breaks, where the grammar turns, where missing fibers decide theology by the width of a crack. Hold on to that image instead, not the press conference, not the headline. A scholar in Geneva, leaning over newspaper and shoeboxes, trying to read a condemned gospel before it disappears again. By the time the world was told what Judas meant, the book had already spent decades being bought, hidden, mishandled, and translated through gaps. In one line, Judas steps forward as the only disciple who knows. In the next, the fragment breaks off. Number 9. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. In March 1543, a printer in Nuremberg set type for a book that rearranged the universe by calculation. Johannes Petraeus had 6 books before him, 196 numbered leaves, and a title that sounded almost safely technical, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. Inside those pages, Nicholas Copernicus did something brutally simple. He moved the sun toward the center. He set the earth in motion. The numbers changed with it. Start with the mechanism. The old problem was not that the sky failed to move. It moved too well, and too strangely. Planets wandered against the background stars. They slowed, stopped, reversed, then resumed. Mars made the geometry especially ugly. In a geocentric system, you could keep saving the appearances, but only by stacking circles on circles, offsets on offsets, until prediction became a repair job. Copernicus kept the circles too. He was still a 16th century astronomer, not a modern one. But he changed the frame. Put the Earth on a yearly path around the sun. Give it a daily rotation. Some of the strangest motions no longer belong to the planets at all. They belong to us. You can feel the trick if you stand still and let the model run. One rotation in about 24 hours explains the sweep of the heavens from east to west. One revolution in about 365 days shifts the sun through the zodiac over the year. A third motion, the one Copernicus used to keep Earth's axis properly oriented, handled the changing relation between equator and ecliptic. Later sensors would target a chapter on Earth's triple motion. The number mattered because the mechanism mattered. Copernicus was not writing a poem about the sun. He was specifying moving parts. In 1539, Georg Joachim Rheticus arrived in Frombork to see the machine's builder in person. Copernicus was no young rebel by then. He was around 66, a cathedral canon, a mathematician, and a man who had spent decades refining tables and arguments without fully releasing the whole thing to the world. Rheticus was the younger man, the one with speed. He studied the system. He saw what was sitting there. He pushed. Without him, the manuscript may have remained a private engine of paper and ink. Knowledge often disappears that way first, not in fire, in a room, unpublished. So Rheticus carried the work to Nuremberg. Petraeus printed it in March 1543. About 400 to 500 copies were run off in that first edition. That is not many. Even now, only around 250 first edition copies are known. The pipeline from mind to page to survival was narrow. A few compositors, a few form changes, a few hundred books, one city, 1 month. Then came the insertion. Before the book appeared, Andreas Osiander, a Lutheran pastor helping oversee the press, slipped in an unsigned note. No author's name, no direct confrontation, just a framing device a few paragraphs long, telling readers that astronomical hypotheses need not be true. They only need to calculate well. Read this system as a mathematical convenience, he said in effect, not as a claim about what the heavens physically are. The change was tiny in page count and massive in consequence. Once that note sat at the front, the whole book cooled. Not false, not denied, buffered. On May 24, 1543, Copernicus died in Frombork at age 70, just as the book entered circulation. The author was gone. The preface remained. For decades, that ambiguity worked. People usually compress this part, but the numbers are clear. Rome did not pounce in 1543. It did not ban the book the week it appeared. It did not treat those 196 leaves as instant contraband. The system circulated as difficult mathematics. Astronomers could use it for calculation, while rejecting its physical truth. That was the compromise Osiander's note served almost perfectly. If the Earth moved only on paper, the tables could live. The second edition, printed in Basel in 1566, ran another 400 to 500 copies. Around 290 copies of that edition are now located. Again, the survival count tells the story. This was influential, but not popular in the modern sense. It spread through universities, observatories, and mathematical circles. Dense text, diagrams, technical Latin, a book more likely to be worked through than waved around in a crowd. Its danger had to be activated by someone else. That someone was Galileo. Telescopic observation and public argument changed the temperature. Copernicus stopped being merely useful and became combustible. If Jupiter had moons, if Venus showed phases, if the heavens were not the clean Aristotelian shells they had been taken for, then heliocentrism was no longer just a calculating trick. It was becoming a claim about reality. The legal problem changed with it. Institutions can tolerate a model more easily than a world. So, on March 5, 1616, Rome's Congregation of the Index suspended on the revolutions until corrected. Count the gap. From March 1543 to March 1616 is 73 years. A book can spend nearly 3/4 of a century as difficult scholarship and only later become dangerous. That matters because it reveals the larger pattern running through this story. Knowledge does not vanish only when it is destroyed. Sometimes it is neutralized first, filed, and allowed to exist in a form that cannot fully speak. Rome's solution in 1616 was not total obliteration, it was editing. On May 15, 1620, the required corrections were issued. 10 specified corrections, 10 cuts, substitutions, and softening moves aimed at one pressure point. Wherever Copernicus seemed to assert Earth's motion as a fact, the wording had to be bent back toward hypothesis. A chapter title referring to Earth's 3 motions had to be recast hypothetically. Statements that the sun is stationary at the center and the Earth moves had to be toned down. Not removed from mathematics, removed from ontology. Look at the precision. Not erase the equations, not burn every copy, Change the verbs. Change assertion into possibility. Change is into if. A forbidden book is not always strangled by prohibition. Sometimes it is domesticated by grammar. The numbers turn forensic again here. 6 books. That sounds complete, almost monumental. But a reader after 1620 was not meeting a stable monument. He was meeting a negotiated object. Depending on where he lived and which copy he held, he might see Osiander's unsigned shield at the front, then Copernicus's own arguments inside, then penciled or printed obedience layered over them by decree. One text, multiple authorities. The page becoming a battlefield measured not in armies but in clauses. So was Osiander protecting the book or betraying it? The arithmetic cuts both ways. Without that unsigned note, on the revolutions might have drawn harder resistance earlier, when its author was still alive, and its print run was only a few hundred copies deep. But the same note also handed later censors a perfect template. Treat heliocentrism as a computational instrument, never as the structure of the world. Survival came with instructions for how to misunderstand it. Officially, Rome did not destroy Copernicus. It suspended a book on March 5, 1616. It corrected it on May 15, 1620. It let it circulate in amended form. The pages stayed alive, the verbs did not. Number 8. The Prince. In 1559, under Pope Paul IV, the Roman Index did not single out one reckless page or one dangerous chapter. It condemned Niccolò Machiavelli entire. Every work, every title. A dead Florentine secretary, buried for 32 years, was suddenly classified as a standing threat to Catholic readers across Europe. The Church was not reacting to a spellbook, a sex manual, or heresy in the usual sense. It was reacting to a method. If Machiavelli was right, rulers did not keep states through holiness. They kept them through timing, force, theater, fear, and selective mercy. Politics stopped looking like a branch of ethics. It looked like a craft. Once power could be studied as technique, the beneficiaries were not always the people willing to admit they used it. Go back a few years, to a place that looks almost too small for a book with this reputation. Early 1513. San Casciano, just outside Florence. Niccolò Machiavelli is 43 years old, and his career is over. The republic he served from 1498 to 1512 as second chancellor and diplomat has collapsed. In 1512, the Medici returned with Spanish and papal backing. The old republican government was dismantled, and Machiavelli was swept out with it. Then came the worst part. Suspected of conspiracy against the restored regime, he was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured for weeks. This is not the image people usually carry, not the smiling mastermind in the margins of European politics, a dismissed official, a prisoner, a man trying to get back in. On December 10, 1513, he wrote to his friend Francesco Vittori. By day, he said, he lived among mud, taverns, card games, and the petty business of country exile. At night, the room changed. He put on formal clothes. He entered the company of ancient authors. He fed himself on the only thing he believed was still truly his, what he had learned from history. In that letter, he mentioned a little work on principalities. That little work became The Prince. Take the coldest possible reading and follow it through. What if The Prince is exactly what it appears to be? A practical manual written by a ruined insider to help a ruling family keep power. Then the scandal is not that Machiavelli admired evil. The scandal is that he organized state survival into usable parts. Cruelty, but measured. Mercy, but timed. Generosity, but only when it buys obedience. Religion, reputation, promises, fear, all treated not as sacred ends, but as instruments to deploy, withhold, stage, or break. The older language of rule said legitimacy flowed from virtue. A prince should be just, pious, faithful, temperate. Machiavelli keeps dragging the reader back to harder ground. Not what should happen, but what does. Not what a ruler owes his soul, but what he must do if he intends to keep his state while surrounded by rivals, conspiracies, mercenaries, fickle allies, and subjects whose loyalty can evaporate in a week. He separates moral goodness from political survival with almost surgical calm. He does not always praise cruelty. He refuses to pretend it disappears because a sermon says it should. That is why the book keeps slipping out of the category people want to trap it in. It is not a cartoon hymn to villainy. It is worse in a more durable way. It teaches that appearances can matter more than interior virtue. A ruler may need to act against faith, against charity, against humanity, against religion, if preserving the state requires it. Not constantly, not randomly, precisely. The origin makes it sharper. This was not a triumphant prince dictating wisdom from a throne room. This was a man excluded from power, riding toward the very house that had crushed his political world. Machiavelli eventually dedicated the work to Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, partly in the hope of returning to public service. Every page carries a double edge. Is he sincerely advising the Medici? Is he advertising his usefulness? Is he exposing the mechanics of tyranny so nakedly that any attentive reader could see through it? Scholars still argue, because the text supports more than one answer, and that uncertainty is part of its staying power. For the people who later banned it, that ambiguity did not make it safer, it made it more volatile. A straightforward, immoral tract can be denounced from the pulpit. A book like this is harder. It borrows the surface of advice literature, the prestige of Roman history, the tone of sober realism. It does not shout. It coolly rearranges the reader's assumptions. You start with a prince. You end with a machine. The timeline matters. Machiavelli was born on May 3, 1469. He served the Florentine Republic for 14 years. He wrote The Prince in the wreckage of 1513. He died in 1527, before the book ever appeared in print. Then, in 1532, 5 years after his death, it was published posthumously. The text entered Europe without its author there to explain, soften, deny, or redirect it. No corrections from the man himself, no public defense. Just the book moving on its own, gathering readers who saw in it either lucid statecraft or distilled corruption. By the time Rome acted in 1559, it was not suppressing a fresh political pamphlet. It was confronting a reputation that had already metastasized. Machiavellian was becoming a category, a way of naming rule without innocence. The index chose the broadest answer available. Not caution around one title, but prohibition of the entire author. That remained the pattern for centuries. The index itself lost legal force in canon law only in 1966, though the Vatican said its moral warnings still stood. The law relaxed, the suspicion lingered. That pattern runs through all these forbidden books. Knowledge does not vanish only when pages are burned. Sometimes it survives in the open, under a stain so heavy that only the shameless will touch it. Teach a generation that a text is poison, and fewer readers will study what it actually says. More will inherit a myth in its place. With Machiavelli, that myth was useful. Call him the prophet of treachery, and you never have to admit how many governments already speak his language fluently. Picture the scene again. A winter evening near San Casciano, mud drying on a discarded pair of work clothes. A dismissed civil servant changing into formal dress to enter, as he put it, the courts of ancient men. A lamp, a desk, a manuscript meant to win favor from the family that destroyed him. He writes a guide to power while standing outside it. Centuries later, the book is feared not because it invents tyranny, but because it strips the mask off techniques rulers would rather call virtue. In the quiet, the page does not look forbidden at all. It looks employable. Number 7. Rights of Man. The pamphlet that turned into evidence. On May 21, 1792, clerks in the British Home Office were buying copies of a book the government wanted people not to read. Not one copy. Copies. They marked them up, noted passages, pulled out lines for prosecution. Outside those offices, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man was moving through London by the cheapest routes available. Shop counters, reform clubs, taverns, borrowed bundles, hands that did not usually hold political theory. One estimate later put circulation in England alone at 1.5 million copies. Even if that number runs high, the scale matters. This was not a rare volume locked in a gentleman's library. It was a mass object. By 1792, Paine was no longer writing a mere defense. In 1791, he answered Edmund Burke. In 1792, he escalated. Burke had defended inherited monarchy, aristocratic order, and the old arrangement of power, as if that arrangement were civilization itself. Paine answered from London with a rival system. Government, he argued, did not descend through blood. Rights did not come from kings. They existed before kings. Part 1 of Rights of Man appeared in 1791 as a rebuttal to Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France. Part 2, published in 1792, crossed a line the British state could no longer ignore. Paine was not simply praising events across the Channel. He was sketching what Britain itself might become: wider suffrage, social provision, attacks on monarchy, political legitimacy grounded in natural rights rather than inheritance. That is what made the document in the file so revealing. The state was not reacting to style, it was reading a program. The program traveled in ways power struggled to control. Expensive books can be denounced from a distance. Cheap books are harder. Rights of Man was sold cheaply, read aloud, passed around, discussed in societies, and reached soldiers. Some reports claim translation into Welsh. The pattern matters. This did not move like elite debate. It moved like contagion. One copy in a tavern could reach 50 ears. A society purchase could be read to a room of men who would never buy it themselves. So when officials counted copies, they counted badly. The audience was larger than the paper trail. Knowledge disappears easily when only a few people hold it. It becomes harder to contain when the few lose their monopoly. The crown moved. The proclamation dated May 21, 1792, issued in the name of George III from Queen's House, warned against wicked and seditious writings. The wording was broad. In practice, everyone knew one of the targets. The language reads almost clinical now, but at the time it signaled something sharper. Discussion itself was being recast as a threat to order. Paine had not raised an army. He had not seized a port. He had made political theory portable. That does not fit the comforting myth of censorship. States do not fear only secrets. They fear clear ideas when clear ideas get cheap. By the time the machinery reached him, Paine was gone. He crossed to France in 1792, and there he was elected to the National Convention. That changed the scene in London. The defendant whose words were underlined in British offices was no longer there to stand under the court's eye. His absence did not cool the case. It made him easier to reshape. On December 18, 1792, at Guildhall in London, before Lord Kenyon and a special jury, Thomas Paine was tried in absentia for seditious libel. Not treason, something narrower, technically, but the categories began to blur. A man attacks monarchy, defends revolution, and proposes a nation built on rights rather than inheritance. The law can call that libel. Public imagination can call it betrayal. Thomas Erskine defended him. That was no small footnote. Erskine was one of the great defense advocates of the age, a man who would later become central in beating back the 1794 treason prosecutions against reformers. He argued, in effect, for the right to political discussion itself. The jury convicted Paine anyway. After that, rights of man changed status. It was no longer merely controversial. It became legally toxic. A bookseller was no longer just a seller. He could be treated as a courier of sedition. Look at the names at the edge of the main event. Thomas Spence, a London bookseller, was committed to Clerkenwell Prison on December 10, 1792, for selling Part 2 of Rights of Man, 8 days before Paine's Guildhall trial. Richard Phillips, bookseller and publisher in Leicester, was imprisoned for 18 months in 1793 for selling it. Those facts show where the state had decided the real battlefield was, not the author in France, the network at home, the counter, the shelf, the man who says, "Here, take this and read." Here, the document stops being a literary controversy and becomes infrastructure. A banned or stigmatized text does not vanish on the day of judgment. It leaves behind concentrations of risk. The author becomes a symbol. The distributors become the casualties. In loyalist imagination, Paine hardened into something close to a traitor, without ever being tried for treason in Britain. Legally, that distinction mattered. Politically, it was useful to blur it. Once Rights of Man could be treated as almost treasonous, later reformers could be framed not as critics, but as latent revolutionaries. In 1794, large portions of the book would be read aloud again as prosecution evidence in the London Corresponding Society treason trials. The words kept coming back to court, so picture the artifact at the center of all this, not as a pristine first edition under glass, but as a working copy in hostile hands, margins marked by officials, pages folded by readers, cheap paper passing through taverns, shops, and barracks. A book arguing that government rests on natural rights, while the government answers by criminalizing the route those rights travel. That is how knowledge can be made to vanish without being destroyed. Possession becomes dangerous. Sale becomes punishable. The text is stained until even curiosity starts to look disloyal. But Rights of Man exposed a problem the state could not quite solve. Once political language becomes simple enough to repeat aloud, the page is no longer the unit that matters. The mouth is. And in Britain, in 1792, that was enough to send men to prison. Number 6. The Communist Manifesto, London, late 1847. You are in a cramped room with men who do not have time for theory anymore. They need a program, fast. The group is called the Communist League. That sounds enormous. It is not. In 1848, its effective size was about 20 members. 20. That is the scale here. Not a mass party, not a continent in motion. A tiny émigré workers' organization, asking two young German writers to put its ideas into a form people can carry in a coat pocket. On November 29, 1847, and through December 8, at the League's Second Congress in London, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels get the assignment. Write the party program, make it clear, make it usable, and make it soon. But Marx delays. He keeps revising, circling, doing the thing brilliant writers do when someone is asked for urgency instead of perfection. By January 1848, League leaders are threatening to give the job to somebody else if he does not finally hand it over. Now picture the pressure. A semi-secret political group, a manuscript still unfinished, Europe already tense enough to crack. And somewhere in London, pages are moving toward a printer, just weeks before the continent catches fire. The legend of this book can fool you. You hear the Communist Manifesto and picture instant detonation. One pamphlet, one publication, then barricades. That is not what happened. The first German copies appeared in London at the end of February 1848. On February 24th, the French Revolution had already broken out. Events were moving faster than the pamphlet. History did not wait for the print run. So the most famous revolutionary tract on Earth begins as a document that is, in practical terms, almost too late. At first, almost too small. Yes, the language hits hard. A specter is haunting Europe. You can feel why that line survived. But the object itself is modest. A party program for a tiny league. A short text meant to define who they are, what they want, and why class conflict is not some temporary disturbance but the engine underneath modern society. It is not born as a sacred text. It is not launched as a bestseller. It is a tool. Its strength is simpler than legend makes it sound. You could print it cheaply, translate it, fold it, hide it, hand it to the next person. In 1850, the first English translation appeared in George Julian Harney's Red Republican, translated by Helen Macfarlane. That sounds like plain publication history, but the scene is bigger than that. A text written for a small German-speaking revolutionary network is crossing language barriers. It is getting a second life. Not because one edition conquered Europe overnight, but because the arguments were compact enough to travel farther than the original organization ever could. And the original organization did not last long. Repression hit hard. After the Cologne Communist trial and the crackdown that followed in 1852, the Communist League was effectively finished. Freeze the story there and the book looks like a failure. A rushed assignment from late 1847. A February 1848 pamphlet overshadowed by events. A network of maybe 20 effective members. Then police pressure. Then collapse. Forbidden books behave oddly. Some are feared for what they say. Others are feared for what they let the state prove about you. The Manifesto slowly becomes the second kind. After the First International. After the Paris Commune. After Marx's name acquires real police value across Europe, the book stops being just an argument and becomes a credential, a sign, a marker. If authorities find it on your shelf, in your satchel, under your bed, they may not care whether you finished page 3. Possession itself starts doing political work. That is how a pamphlet written for a marginal league turns into a forbidden object with a reach far larger than its first audience. Not because every censor had patiently refuted its theory. The cover could stand in for allegiance. The book could function like a badge. You can watch that shift over decades. On May 10, 1933, in Nazi Germany, university students and Nazi activists staged the great public book burnings. Marx and Engels were among the authors thrown into the flames as un-German. This was not a response to a fresh 1848 publication crisis. It was a ritual, a purification ceremony. The point was symbolic violence in public. Not a debate with a text, a warning through a text. Warnings like that teach people quickly that the physical book is now evidence. When states ban or stigmatize a work like this, they are not always trying to erase the idea completely. Sometimes they choose something more efficient. They make the object radioactive. They turn a pamphlet into a test. Keep it, and you declare yourself. Sell it, and you implicate yourself. Display it, and you save the police a step. That pattern did not end with the 20th century. Go to Jakarta, September 24th, 2016. Indonesia International Book Fair. 4 Malaysian men are detained for selling a translated edition of the Communist Manifesto. Not in a secret cellar, not in some guerrilla camp, at a book fair, out in the open. Police attention was tied not only to the text itself, but to the hammer and sickle symbol on the cover. That detail matters because the forbidden object splits in two. There is the argument inside the book, then there is the packaging outside it, the cover, the symbol, the visual signal that lets law and public fear collapse the difference between reading, endorsing, organizing, and belonging. You do not even need to open the pages. The artifact has already testified against you. So was this book dangerous because people feared its theory would persuade readers? Yes, sometimes. But often it was dangerous because it simplified suspicion. It let governments, police, and hostile movements treat ownership as confession. After that, knowledge does not have to be disproved to disappear. It just has to become costly to touch. That connects straight back to the larger pattern running through this whole story. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace? And who benefits when it does? Sometimes, nobody burns every copy. They do something cleaner. They attach enough risk to the object that distribution shrinks on its own. Sellers hesitate. Libraries hide it. Printers back off. Readers decide curiosity is not worth a record, a raid, or a reputation. The strangest thing about the Communist Manifesto is that it did not begin as an explosive master plan. It began as a rushed internal commission in late 1847 for a tiny organization that barely had 20 effective members. For a moment, it looked as if history would leave it behind. It did not. History repurposed it. The pamphlet outlived the league that ordered it. It outlived the revolutions that overshadowed it. It outlived the regimes that burned it. In that afterlife, the book became dangerous in a way its first printers could barely have measured. Less as a manual, more as a portable piece of incriminating identity. One of the clearest eyewitness lines in this story comes not from 1848, but from a firelit square in 1933, when the point was to turn possession into shame. The students shouted it into the flames, against class struggle and materialism, for the community of the people and an idealistic way of life. Number 5. The Hammer of Witches. On a winter day in 1485, in Innsbruck, the notary's table is covered in papers before anyone speaks. Wax seals, depositions, names. A Dominican inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer has come to prove that witchcraft is not rumor, not village spite, but an organized assault on Christian society. He has authority close at hand, too. A papal bull issued on December 5, 1484, empowering inquisitors to pursue alleged witches in the German lands. The parchment speaks before he does. But the woman he wants does not behave like the proof he needs. Helena Schäuberin stands in the courtroom under the eyes of clerics, officials, and townspeople who know exactly who she is. She is not an abstraction, not a demon in a sermon. She is a local woman with neighbors, history, and a voice. Witnesses say she cursed Kramer in the street. They say she opposed his preaching openly. They say she treated him with contempt when deference was expected. In another setting, that might be a petty humiliation. Here, inside a church trial in 1485, it is being turned into something much larger. Kramer presses the case as if insult has become evidence. He widens the net. Other women are drawn in beside Schäuberin. The charges begin to gather that familiar weight trials borrow from one another. One story reinforces the next. One accusation makes the next easier to hear. The room starts to lean toward the script he wants. Female malice, secret acts, corruption hidden under ordinary faces. But Innsbruck does not give him the triumph he came for. A defense lawyer named Johann Merward starts pulling at the procedure instead of the gossip. Not the spectacle, the method. How were these accusations gathered? Who was examined? What counted as proof? Bishop Georg Golser's representative listens, and the objections do not vanish into the floor. They stick. They are upheld. The case that was supposed to display a diabolical network begins to look badly handled, overreaching, unstable. Schäuberin is released on bond. Hold on to that moment. Not a pyre, not a confession, a release. The woman at the center of the case walks out alive, and the trial is never resumed. Kramer came to turn one woman into a pattern, but the proceeding collapses around him instead. After she is gone, the bench is empty. The cold stays. The papers are still there. Depositions, objections, notes in a hand trained to turn speech into record. Kramer is left with the one thing an ambitious prosecutor can least endure: a public defeat with witnesses. He had a stage, charges, clerical backing, and a target. The machinery jammed. Local authorities did not let him finish the story he wanted to tell. He is ordered out of Innsbruck. Then the scene moves from courtroom wood to printer's type. In 1486 and 1487, in the world of presses and corrected proofs, Kramer begins rebuilding the lost trial, in a form that cannot interrupt him. The book that emerges is called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It is not written like a private grievance, but that grievance is inside it, driving the whole machine. What one courtroom refused to ratify, print will now repeat until it sounds settled. The design is visible in the book itself. 3 parts. First, proof that witches exist and that disbelief is dangerous. Then descriptions of what witches do: maleficium, sexual corruption, spiritual submission to the devil, acts made vivid enough to feel undeniable. Then the final turn, the one that matters most in practice: procedure. How to investigate, how to question, how to move from suspicion to confession. That last part lands on the table like a toolkit. A magistrate opens the volume. An inquisitor runs his finger down the page. The text does not simply say evil is real. It tells officials what to do next. It gives them a sequence: accusation, interrogation, pressure, confession, sentence. Because it is a printed book, the sequence does not stay in one failed courtroom in Tyrol. It travels. The authority around it is part of the performance. Papal material appears near the front. Endorsements and learned framing give the object the look of institutional certainty. On the page, it arrives dressed for obedience. A reader in a city office does not meet Kramer the man, stung by defeat in 1485. He meets a folio presenting itself as settled expertise. You are that reader now. The year is 1494. The copy in your hands has 146 unnumbered leaves. It smells of rag paper and lampblack. The type is dense. The margins are narrow. At first glance, there is nothing theatrical in the object. No screaming victims, no bonfires, just columns of Latin, careful headings, a serious tone. The calm surface is the trick. Every page teaches officials how to convert suspicion into record. Once record exists, it begins breeding its own reality. A woman is said to have caused illness. Another is said to have spoiled a birth. Another spoke too sharply to a clergyman. The charge no longer has to stand alone, because the book has supplied precedent, language, posture. It has made panic legible to courts. Printers keep multiplying it, even when church theologians criticize it, even when its claims are disputed, even when its endorsement is less solid than it looks. Secular magistrates do not need perfect theology. They need usable process. So, edition follows edition. From 1486 to 1669, 36 editions spread through Europe. One local collapse becomes a continental instrument. By the time the wider age of witch trials has run its course, between roughly 1450 and 1750, around 110,000 trials will be recorded, and about half will end in execution. Almost 3/4 of the accused will be women. Those numbers go far beyond one author and one book. But inside this room, inside this object, part of the conversion is visible. Fear becoming administration. Back in Innsbruck, none of that can be seen yet. There is only Kramer leaving a city that refused him, carrying the memory of a woman who would not submit to his script. Helena Schäuberin does not burn. She does something worse for him. She survives contradiction. She forces the accusation to meet procedure, and for once, procedure does not bend enough. So he builds a procedure of his own. A compositor locks the final lines into place. The form is inked. A fresh sheet is laid down. Pressure comes on through the press. When it lifts, the page is no longer a failed case. It is a manual, one that tells judges deception can be useful, that torture can open truth, that female bodies and female speech should be read as evidence of hidden corruption. The woman who walked free in 1485 is gone from sight now, but the next woman will meet her accuser already armed. The sheet is hung with the others, more pages dry beside it. Gathered, folded, stacked, They begin to resemble a set of instructions waiting for a door to open. Footsteps in the corridor. A magistrate has come to collect a copy. Number 4. The Book of Abramelin, The House on the Lake. In 1899, Aleister Crowley paid £2,000 for Boleskine House on the southeastern shore of Loch Ness, about twice its market value. He did not buy it for the view. He bought it for seclusion, for locked doors, for a ritual that was supposed to take months, possibly far longer, and could not safely be interrupted once it began. The book he carried into that house had appeared in English only 1 year earlier, in 1898, when S.L. Macgregor Mathers published a translation in London from a manuscript in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris. Its title was already doing half the work, The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. What gave it its menace was the schedule. Crowley was 24 years old. Mathers was older, already one of the central figures of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, already turning scattered manuscripts into modern occult weapons. This one arrived as an inheritance. The text claimed to be the final instruction of Abraham of Worms to his son Lamech, dated 1458, held back until the son was old enough to receive it. Not a spellbook tossed into public circulation. A private transfer. A father telling a son how to do something that could fail the way a loaded firearm fails. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is procedural. Follow the sequence, or lose control of it. Inside that frame story, Abraham wanders through Europe and Egypt looking for teachers. Most fail him. Some are frauds, some are showmen. Then he meets Abramelin, an Egyptian adept who offers not a trick, but a system. First purification, then prayer, then withdrawal from ordinary life. Then contact with the holy guardian angel. Only after that, only after the operator is supposed to have secured divine authority, comes the part that made the book notorious. Commanding spirits through names, seals, and word-square talismans. Not fortune-telling. Not incense and atmosphere, a program for forcing the invisible to obey. Forbidden books are often dangerous because they ask so little. Read a page, repeat a line, make a gesture. Abramelin asks for your calendar, your house, your diet, your sex life, your attention. In Mathers' version, the operation is often understood as 6 months. In the broader manuscript tradition recovered much later, it can run to 18 months. 6 months is already enough to dismantle a life. 18 is enough to replace one. So when Crowley moved into Boleskine, the risk was not simply that he believed in demons. He was building an environment where nothing ordinary could interrupt an extraordinary act. Boleskine was chosen for that purpose, remote enough to isolate him, large enough to organize his days around the work. Far enough from London that a man could imagine stepping outside history for a while. You can see it, the edge of Loch Ness, cold light on black water, a house turned inward. Rooms arranged around silence. Every morning, the same prayers. Every restriction observed. Every lapse heavy with meaning, because the whole rite depends on continuity. The book promises that if the operator persists long enough, he will reach the holy guardian angel, and then compel darker forces into service. But the promise has a catch. If the first half fails, the second half is no longer mastery. It is exposure. A year earlier, none of this would have happened in English. Mathers is the hinge. In 1898, he takes a French manuscript from Paris and makes it legible to the occult underground of London. That looks like scholarship. It was also distribution. Knowledge disappears and mutates that way. The old, difficult, manuscript-bound thing becomes newly available, but only in the shape given to it by the translator. Mathers' Abramelin was the version Crowley inherited. It was famous, influential, and incomplete. That gap matters more than it sounds. Mathers worked from a French manuscript tradition of 3 books. Later work by Georg Dehn and Stephen Guth, published in English in 2006 and revised in 2015, drew on wider evidence from the German tradition, where Abramelin appears in 4 books instead. The timing shifts too, not just a compact ordeal, but a longer one. Not just one stable text, but conflicting forms. The classic Abramelin that entered modern occult culture was already a narrowed version of a messier original. Crowley did not approach the book in its fullest surviving form. He approached Mathers' machine. Crowley began the operation at Boleskine, but he did not finish it. Then the crisis inside the Golden Dawn pulled him away. His departure was practical, organizational, political. But in a rite built on uninterrupted devotion, leaving early did not read as a normal interruption. It read as a breach. Later legend enlarged that breach into part of Boleskine's curse. stories accumulated. The house became less a building than a receiver for unfinished ritual. This is how such books survive in culture. One documented action, then a decade of atmosphere attached to it. The atmosphere can hide the sharper fact. Abramelin is not famous because it is flamboyant. It is famous because it is disciplined. The practical section includes word squares for very worldly results, causing spirits to appear, discovering treasure, producing invisibility, stirring storms. Strip away the velvet and you find a workbook of control. Even its origin refuses to stay still. The book presents itself as Jewish magic from a 15th century Abraham of Worms, but scholars have long noticed complications. The psalm quotations appear to follow the Latin Vulgate rather than a Hebrew tradition. The named author may be historical, disguised, or a literary mask adopted later. Even the supposed inheritance from father to son may be part of the performance. Crowley walked into this story thinking he had found an old road to power. But the road was already layered with translation, omission, and uncertain identity. He shut himself away to obtain clean access to sacred authority. Yet the book in his hands was already a contaminated transmission. A secret text did not survive untouched. It survived in a form complete enough to command obedience, while hiding what had been lost. Officially, the Book of Abramelin is a grimoire about angelic contact and the rule of spirits. In practice, the version that shaped modern legend was also a broken chain of custody, a partial translation carried into a locked house by a man willing to reorganize his life around it, and obeyed as if it were complete. Number 3. The Anarchist Cookbook. In December 1969, William Powell was 19 years old in Greenwich Village, New York. He was angry about the Vietnam draft. He believed the state's monopoly on force could be answered with counterforce in print. He quit his bookstore job, went into public library stacks, and began pulling material from military manuals and other open sources. Not stolen files, not a secret cache, public shelves. By 1971, Lyle Stewart had published The Anarchist Cookbook. What entered the world was smaller, cheaper, and stranger than the legend that followed it. 152 pages, mass market format, sold like a paperback, and tracked like contraband. The myth says this was a forbidden master key to destruction. The file says something colder. It was a teenage compilation, assembled from material already out in the open. Almost immediately, the book itself became the more volatile device. Start with the mechanism, because this is where the myth usually cheats. The sensational version treats the book as if it worked by hiding knowledge. It did not. Powell's basic move was aggregation. He took instructions, formulas, and techniques scattered across manuals and publications and compressed them into one object. He stripped away context and gave that object a title that promised transgression before you even opened page 1. That matters because a scattered fact behaves one way on a shelf and another way in a branded package. In a library, information sits buried among indexes, jargon, and boredom. In a paperback called The Anarchist Cookbook, the same material arrives pre-dramatized, simplified, and socially legible. You are not just reading. You are holding the thing people whisper about. The mechanism was never only technical. It was editorial, compression, rebranding, and the thrill of possession. The early paper trail points somewhere much less cinematic than the legend. On March 16, 1971, just as the book appeared, the FBI was already asking basic questions. Was William Powell a real person or a pseudonym? Where was the book being sold? How wide was its distribution? And did publication violate federal law? That is the first clue. Investigators were not acting like men who had intercepted an occult weapon. They were doing legal triage. Name, address, stores, statute. Over time, the released FBI file ran 171 pages, covering 1971 to 1999. Page after page, the pattern is not mythic panic, but bureaucratic uncertainty. The most important uncertainty was simple. Did this book clearly cross a legal line? A Justice Department review examined multiple statutes and came back without the dramatic answer people expected. The book was ugly. It was provocative. It gathered instructions that made officials deeply uncomfortable. But under the cited federal laws, it did not clearly amount to direct criminal incitement in the neat way a headline would like. Here the evidence cuts against the legend. The state treated the book as suspicious, but suspicion is not the same thing as a clean prohibition. The famous forbidden manual entered the world in a gray zone. watched, circulated, examined, but not cleanly erased. That gray zone let the book mutate into something more powerful than its contents. Authorities traced sales. Newspapers mentioned it. Police reports and courtrooms repeated the title. At that point, the book stopped functioning only as text. It became a signal, a label, a ready-made shorthand for dangerous intent. Because the title was so memorable, later files and copycats could piggyback on it with almost no effort. This is the part the myth hides. The Anarchist Cookbook was not one stable object moving intact through history. It became a brand-name ghost. Original 1971 paperback, later reprints, altered versions, internet compilations, updated files with similar titles. All of it collapsed into one ominous phrase in the public imagination. So when a seizure turns up in a police file decades later, you hit a basic forensic problem. Are we even talking about Powell's book anymore? Now look at Powell himself, because here the story bends hard. The stock version casts him as the permanent apostle of his own book. The record says the opposite. He later became a teacher. He publicly disowned the text. He said its central premise had been wrong. In the mid-1970s, he asked for it to be withdrawn. But he could not simply kill the thing he had made, because he did not control the copyright. The publisher did. The object detached from the author and kept walking. That is not a metaphor. It is a custody fact. A 19-year-old protest artifact outlived the politics that produced it, outlived the author's own judgment of it, and kept circulating anyway because the legal rights sat elsewhere. That detail changes the whole case. The myth imagines a stable pipeline from authorial intent to real-world use. He wrote a dangerous manual, therefore the manual did what he meant it to do. The evidence shows a messier machine. The original text was assembled from open sources, legally scrutinized without a clean prosecutable hook, then reabsorbed into decades of panic, in which title recognition did half the work. Powell wanted it gone. It stayed. He changed. The object did not. Or more precisely, it changed too much, copied, digitized, mislabeled, and dragged into new contexts he did not control. Australia's record shows how long that afterlife lasted. The country refused classification on May 10, 1985. Decades later, the title still appears in a 2016 classification record, marked RC, refused classification again, with NSW Police as applicant. Same name, same aura. By then, the forensic question was even murkier, because the internet had done what print could not. It dissolved the chain of custody. Once the title migrates online, one file can become 50, one scan can pick up editions, and one notorious paperback can be blamed for material it never originally contained. The reputation became cumulative, even when the object was unstable. On July 11, 2016, William Powell died in Halifax, Canada, aged 66. By then, the book had spent roughly 45 years doing something its author could neither endorse nor reverse. It remained on shelves, in databases, in censorship records, in police language, in the imagination of people who often knew the title better than the text. The cheap book stayed behind. The title kept moving. Number 2. The Turner Diaries. On April 19, 1995, at 9:02 a.m., a rented Ryder truck exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The blast killed 168 people, including 19 children. Windows blew out across blocks. Concrete gave way floor by floor. In the first minutes, nobody at the scene was reading ideology. They were reading debris. Investigators began with the same hard facts in front of them. One truck, one detonation point, one axle thrown clear, intact enough to outlast the rest of the vehicle. More than 28,000 interviews would follow, more than 43,000 leads. But the case first bent around a piece of metal with a serial trail. 90 minutes later, about 80 miles north of the city, Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger stopped a yellow Mercury Marquis with no license plate. The driver was Timothy McVeigh. Hanger arrested him on a weapons charge. The deadliest mass casualty bombing in the United States had just happened, and the man later convicted for it was already in custody for something smaller, simpler, almost clerical. No plate. Illegal handgun. Paperwork before motive. The axle led agents to Junction City, Kansas. The rental record led them to a false name. Hotel staff helped narrow that false name to a real one. The blast site in Oklahoma and the traffic stop on Interstate 35 stopped looking like separate facts. They became one line. That line reached the Mercury. Inside the Mercury, among anti-government material, investigators found excerpts from a novel, not a manifesto written for court, not a coded memo passed hand to hand, a book. The dates matter. First 1975, in serial form, in a National Alliance publication called Attack. Then 1978, collected as a novel. The author's real name was William Luther Pierce. The name on the cover was Andrew MacDonald. Pierce was not some obscure crank writing into a void. He led the neo-Nazi National Alliance. The pseudonym did not conceal the politics. It packaged them more efficiently. Look at how the book is built. That is where it does its work. The narrator is not William Pierce. He is Earl Turner, a fictional member of a white supremacist underground called the Organization. The text presents itself as a diary, a found document, a record written from inside a future victory. Propaganda usually asks the reader to imagine a world that does not yet exist. This book skips that uncertainty. It does not say, "Here is what we want." It says, "Here is what happened." Its fictional revolution begins in 1991. 4 digits, plain and modern, not symbolic, not medieval, not mythic. 1991 makes the fantasy feel scheduled, like something delayed rather than impossible. Read enough political fiction and the trick is obvious. Read this one in the markets where McVeigh moved, and the effect hardens. It gives rage a calendar. McVeigh did not just own the text, he sold copies at gun shows. That detail is easier to miss now, after the internet flattened everything into files. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it mattered. A paperback handed across a folding table was not just information. It was endorsement, recruitment, and ritual in one motion. Cash changed hands. The buyer saw the seller's face. The book entered a network already primed to trust it. So when investigators found excerpts in his car, they were not looking at some random novel pulled from a gas station spinner rack. They were looking at one point in a physical circulation system. Meetings, mail orders, gun shows, photocopies, movement literature. A book first serialized in 1975 was still moving strongly enough to surface in a bombing investigation in 1995. If you want to understand how dangerous knowledge travels, stay with that. It rarely survives because it is brilliant. It survives because it has infrastructure. The numbers do not allow a neat moral equation. One novel, one bombing. It is tempting to draw a straight line and stop there. The evidence does not quite allow that. McVeigh had other fuel already burning. Waco in 1993, Ruby Ridge in 1992, anti-government rage, gun politics, the widening militia culture of the early 1990s. So the forensic question is not whether the book mattered, it is how it mattered. Did it supply the plan? Parts of the mythology, clearly. Did it supply permission? Possibly. Did it supply a script that older grievances could be poured into until they looked like destiny? That may be closer. Extremist texts often work less like blueprints than like measuring devices. A reader brings anger, humiliation, paranoia, racial hatred. The text gives that mix a scale. It tells him his private fury belongs to history. This case sits apart from a banned grimoire or a censored political tract. There was no hidden wisdom here. The prose itself was never the point. The point was the frame. Found diary, future regime, named enemies, staged collapse. The book turned fantasy into sequence. Step into that sequence, and violence can start to feel less random to the person committing it. It starts to arrive in episodes. After Oklahoma City, the book's status changed. Before April 19, 1995, it was extremist fiction circulating through white supremacist and anti-government milieus. After April 19th, it became exhibit-grade context. Not illegal by itself, not a smoking gun by itself, but no longer easy to dismiss as harmless fantasy. A paperback had entered the chain of evidence around 168 deaths. The larger point comes into focus here. Hard-won knowledge that took generations to build can vanish without a trace. Usable myths often do not. Bad systems are often better at preserving them than good societies are at preserving difficult truths. One demands study, the other fits in a glove box. The investigation scaled upward through tens of thousands of interviews and leads. The cultural aftershock spread outward through one simpler fact. A novel had traveled from 1975 serial pages to a 1995 bomb scene without losing its audience. 20 years, same text, New Dead. Earl Turner was fictional. The body count was not. Number 1. Mein Kampf. On April 1st, 1924, Adolf Hitler walked into Landsberg prison to serve a 5-year sentence for the failed beer hall putsch. He was 34 years old, convicted, publicly embarrassed. For any ordinary radical politician, that should have been the end. Landsberg did not cut him off from the world. Visitors came and went. Party loyalists circulated. Notes moved. Conversations continued. Inside that cell, punishment turned into production. A failed coup was recast as prophecy. If the text he began there had remained what it first was, a bitter, rambling prison manuscript, it would sit in history as one more ugly document from one more defeated extremist. Millions of Germans would never have received it as instruction, ceremony, and state-approved identity. The consequences are concrete. No wedding copy in the apartment. No official prestige object on the shelf. No ideological primer traveling with a uniform. Without power, it is a rant. With power, it becomes infrastructure. His publisher, Max Amann, of Franz Ayer Verlag, grasped one thing at once. Hitler's original title was long, clumsy, and self-pitying. It was cut down to 2 words, Mein Kampf, my struggle, a slogan dressed as autobiography. Volume 1 appeared on July 18, 1925, in a first printing of 10,000 copies. That number lands hard. Not a secret manuscript, not a hidden tract passed hand to hand. 10,000 copies, printed openly, sold in bookstores, entering ordinary rooms. The prose was never what made it historically lethal. It was bloated, repetitive, unpleasant to read. Germany was not seized by literary brilliance. The book sat there and waited. People often imagine dangerous books exploding on contact, recognized instantly for what they are. Mein Kampf did not move like that. It existed in public and still remained limited at first. Bad texts do not need elegance. They need a machine willing to carry them. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. In that instant, a poorly selling prison manifesto changed category. The paper was the same. The sentences were the same. The hatreds were still laid out in black and white. What changed was the force behind them. Now those pages stood behind the state. Readers did not suddenly discover hidden depth. The government wrapped authority around the book and distributed it as belonging. The numbers then rise in a way no ordinary book ever could. It became a prestige object, a wedding gift for newly married couples, a soldier's item, a visible marker of loyalty. Sales surged after 1933 and made Hitler wealthy. By 1944, more than 12 million copies had been printed. Hold on that number. 12 million, not 12,000. Not a niche circulation at the edge of the culture. 12 million means the manifesto of a failed putschist had been turned into furniture inside the Reich. You could walk into a home and find it there, not because the household had hunted down forbidden knowledge, but because the regime had made possession feel normal. This is where the book pulls away from the other cases. Many forbidden books are feared because they hide something. Secret rites, censored science, tactical instructions. Here, the text was not hidden. The hatred was there. The obsessions were there. The future program was there in ugly outline. Societies often fail to act on open threats when those threats are padded with bad prose, self-mythology, and political theater. The force of this book was not concealment. It was normalization. It sat in plain sight while a state taught people to read it not as a warning, but as a credential. After 1945, that left a problem unlike the others. What do you do with a book that is both evidence and propaganda? Allied and Bavarian authorities did not mainly solve it by hunting down every surviving copy and burning it. Existing copies remained in libraries, archives, and private collections. The mechanism was colder. Bavaria controlled the copyright and used it to block new German editions. For decades, the ban most people imagined was not a simple ban on possession. It was a legal choke point on republication. That choice says a great deal. Officials were not fighting a ghost story. They were fighting re-entry. A text that had once ridden state power into 12 million copies could not be allowed to stroll back into the market looking merely historical, merely collectible, merely controversial. Once an object like this returns to bookstores, context starts to peel away. First, it looks like a relic, then a provocation, then a badge. Copyright, though, is a timer, not a tomb. On January 1st, 2016, Bavaria's control expired. After 70 years, the barrier that had kept new German editions out of circulation was gone. The taboo did not end with a raid or a trial. It ended at midnight, by calendar. 8 days later, on January 8, 2016, the Munich Institute for Contemporary History released its answer. A 2-volume critical edition running about 2,000 pages, armed with roughly 3,700 annotations. That was the counterattack, not silence, not ceremonial disgust, saturation. Overwhelm Hitler's text with scholarship, force every claim into context, pin every lie to evidence, turn the manifesto into an object that could no longer move freely without historians attached to every paragraph. It was an extraordinary idea, and maybe the only serious one left. If a poisonous text survives by being mythologized, the antidote is exposure so dense that the myth suffocates. That solution carried its own risk. Put it back in print, even critically, and you also put it back into the cultural bloodstream. Give it bookstore presence, newspaper coverage, waiting lists, fresh arguments, and the old object gains new symbolic life. Historians argued the annotations would demystify it. Critics warned that republication itself could function as advertising. Strong demand in 2016 kept the contradiction alive. The forbidden book had returned, but only inside a paper fortress built to contain it. The final shape of Mein Kampf is stranger than a simple ban, and more dangerous than a simple read. It began as the prison manuscript of a failed agitator on April 1, 1924. It appeared in 10,000 copies on July 18, 1925. It became state doctrine after January 30, 1933. It reached more than 12 million copies by 1944. After 1945, Germany tried to stop it from reproducing, not by pretending it had never existed, but by locking the printing press. The book was never just a book. It was a state amplifier waiting for state power. Then a legal problem waiting for copyright to expire. Then a historical toxin reissued with 3,700 warnings attached. The unsettling possibility is not that people failed to understand what it said. It is that they understood enough, and once power arrived, that was enough. When the critical edition finally appeared, the editors chose a line that was plain and almost surgical. Hitler's words are confronted with facts.